Well, if you get there, there's some point at which you want to migrate potentially out of the CEO slot. Family companies tend to do that generation 3 or 4. Entrepreneurs tend to be a little slower in moving out of the C-suite. So this might be a little ahead of you. But if you're selecting the CEO, and I'm now talking in a publicly traded enterprise that's been going for some years, if not decades, it is the sacred task of the board to get that right. You get the wrong CEO in there, pretty much everything is going to be destroyed. You're going to lose your top talent. You're going to lose your sales. You're going to lose your community support. It's going to be a nightmare, and you're going to probably attract a few activists who are going to throw you out of your job as well, whether you're chair or a director. There's no, on the activist world, there's no room for sympathy. If you're lagging your peer group, you are going to be attacked. So it's one of the lessons that came out of the Engine No. 1 Exxon assault. I asked Chris James, the CEO of Engine No. 1, I said, well, tell me, Chris, how did you pick on Exxon? And there were a number of reasons, but one of them was terrible performance in a relative peer group. They were the worst of the major oil companies by a considerable margin. So if you're not well equipped with a good CEO and your margins are shrinking and you're drifting down the peer evaluation list, you can be absolutely confident that somebody's going to be on your case, and they may well show up and they may well win a proxy battle that puts you on your rear end. Last year, there were over 800 proxy battles around the world in publicly traded companies, over 500 of them in the United States alone. So if you're out there in public, management's underperforming or performed well but needs to retire, you're going to have to find a new CEO. And that is your sacred responsibility. It's your job alone. In most other jobs of the board, you're dealing with the management team, but alone is you and your colleagues on the board selecting the next leader of this organization. The way to start that exercise that I've always used is to say to yourself, well, what's different about this job? I mean, as a CEO, you were head of sales and now you're CEO, still head of sales? No. Were you CFO and still CFO, now head of sales and CFO? No. You are the unique sole depository of all the investment decisions that are going to be made. You have a unique new job of working with the board and your stakeholders, which is sort of upward. So downward, you've got capital allocation, both human and financial. Upwards, you've got all of this stuff with stakeholders and the board, which you've never done before. And outwardly, you stand for the company. You are kind of the person who embodies the corporation. These are very different characteristics. A.G. Lafley, the former head of Procter & Gamble, was the CEO chair. And he said, now, most people would say CEO stands for Chief Executive Officer. But in my case, I've got 16 executives who run multi-billion-dollar global businesses. I'm not really all that likely to be able to help them running those 16 businesses. I define CEO as Chief External Officer. I'm the one that's out there looking at the horizon, finding what the incoming missiles are that could possibly transform our business. Then I have to determine what it is we might do in order to either accommodate that change or to get in front of it or to ignore it. And then I have to decide how to do it inside. I am the Chief External Officer. Now there's a role, if you're thinking of attributes, where you have to have an executive who has a passionate curiosity. These would be some of the attributes, and who has a huge capability of working in an uncertain, fuzzy world of multidimensional forces and pressures. So CEO, Chief External Officer. Every executive I've interviewed who became CEO, and I must have done a dozen of them, has said to me, it's a completely different job, David, than anything I've ever done before. So your first business as a director is to understand what is different, and then to understand the attributes that go with that difference. So that's now done. The second component, everybody you hire then ought to be able to cope with these new responsibilities that they've never been exposed to before. Second thing is, where do we want to go with this company? I've got an example that GlaxoSmithKline, the pharma company, hired a female who was with a beauty line in their galaxy of companies to take them more into consumer goods and less in science. And while they were doing that, Nestle was going exactly the opposite way, saying we're a consumer goods products company. We need somebody to help us more with the science. So it's being a different job and what attributes that entails. You must have that. That's a necessary set of conditions. And then you add to that, what are we trying to do strategically as a company? Nestle wanted to get more, quote, scientific. GlaxoSmithKline wanted to get more consumer goods oriented. So it's a combination of those two things. If you rely only on interviews around the boardroom table, you're going to make a mistake. Warren Buffett says the biggest mistake of any board of governors I've ever seen is relying on an interview to select the CEO. It may be a necessary condition that that person really blew you off your seat, but it's not a sufficient condition. You therefore have to look externally for validation of that person's track record. For example, did they file their tax receipts? Have they filed them for 5 years? What are the references from previous employers or other employees? How well do we know them as a director? So it's a whole combination of things. You got to work it, because if you get it wrong, nothing's going to go right. And my hero here is a Greek philosopher named Euripides. And Euripides said, leave no stone unturned. So this is your sacred task as a board if you're at that position of trying to find a new CEO. Work it and work it to death. One last thing, the work done by the Harvard Business Review shown pretty dramatically that the most successful global CEOs are those that are promoted from within. They every year pick the top 100 CEOs from over 12,000 publicly traded companies, and they have a whole bunch of criteria. Let's just assume that their evaluations are correct. Of those 100, over the last 5 years, a full 85% are promoted from within. So it doesn't guarantee your success, but it does say to you, if that's the case, and if we think we're going to be moving towards a new CEO, we'd better, as a board of directors, be investing a ton more of our time in the HR function. Otherwise, we're missing the biggest opportunity to fill the hole that's going to occur when our CEO departs. And a last point, Eric Barton, for 8 years the managing director of McKinsey, made it his job to talk to a CEO every week. So 50 weeks times 8 is 400 CEOs he talked to. His book was called Talent. And his hypothesis is you should never have a strategy plan without a people plan. You've got to work the training. And that's not just a tick-the-box exercise. It's a really in-depth piece of work for every director and for every HR committee. So if you have to find a CEO, this is a major step forward. It requires a huge amount of work. The odds are you'll get it better if you promote somebody from inside. But either way, you're going to have to work this one to death. It's drown all other tools and make sure your sacred task of selecting the CEO is done effectively, efficiently, and successfully.